Ladies and gentlemen, may I request you all to please be seated. The Honourable Minister is going to be with us any moment. Please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honourable Minister for Finance and Corporate Affairs, Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman, going to join us any moment. She'll be accompanied by the Chair of B20 India, Mr. N. Chandrasekaran, and the President of CII, Mr. R. Dinesh. Global growth and what roles governments, multilaterals, and businesses can play. And we have with us today the Honourable Minister for Finance and Corporate Affairs, Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman, who will address this assembly. A warm welcome to her. May I request Mr. Chandrasekaran to please present a small token to Madam Sitharaman. Yes. And if I could request you, sir, to please welcome and make the introductory remarks, Mr. Chandrasekaran. Do you want to speak from here?
Honorable Finance Minister, ladies and gentlemen, first I would like to extend a very warm welcome to the Finance Minister on behalf of all of us. Let me first start with another positive news, especially for you. Madam Finance Minister, I was talking to the President of the World Economic Forum while I was waiting for you to arrive. He just casually mentioned to me that this year, India will contribute 16% of the global growth. So I probably have given you a data point which you have not heard from anyone because it's just hot off the press. Yes, please.
He mentioned casually.
So he mentioned it casually, and I thought immediately I should capture that. I want to just take a minute to set the context. Madam Finance Minister, under the G20 finance track, you have been doing enormous work and making some very compelling recommendations for the G20. we have been closely associated with the finance track, and many recommendations and work are going in the direction of international cooperation and finance for global development, sustainability financing, and for inclusive growth. In the B20, we are involved in 9 different themes, which I will not get into now. There are 2 specific finance tracks, but all the work we do has elements of all the topics that the G20 finance track is working on. We have some solid recommendations on financing for climate change, how to bring private capital, and in fact, we have even outlined a very strong follow-up action. And we also have a number of recommendations on promoting economic growth, revival of growth across the globe, and one fundamental theme that has gone through all the aspects of B20 programs is inclusion. Inclusion from the point of view of gender diversity, women, MSME, Global South, digital inclusion. So there are a number of recommendations, but all of which will have a profound effect on what you are trying to do in the finance track. So our recommendations will reach you, and we hope that it will have your full approval and support as we take the whole recommendations to the G20. With those words, I really want to thank you for making time for us today, and we are all eager to hear from you, ma'am.
Good afternoon, and it's such a pleasure to be here to see this gathering. As I was entering, I just checked up, because since the morning, the few people who met me have been speaking about this gathering here and told me it's a huge affair. And I said, oh, so how huge actually was it was left to my imagination. So I wanted a bit of a prep before I entered the hall, so I did ask, how huge is it? But it is huge. I can feel it now. So I've been asked to speak on key priorities for sustained global economic recovery. Sustained global economic recovery is, I think, not just this year, but next few years will be the issue to talk about. So even as all the economies are trying to come out of the COVID, the pandemic, and recovery after that, and so on, sustaining that growth is becoming the main question, not just because of the individual, each economy having its own special situation which has come out of the way in which each of us have handled the COVID time lockdown, and also because the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war, the impact has affected us in different ways. So as a result, sustaining global economic recovery, which actually was emanating out of the COVID time crisis, but being added in by the various developing situations, and the war, the food security related issues, energy security related issues, the transition of from fossil fuel to green issues, climate change issues, all are, if anything, aggravating the concerns of how to sustain this economic recovery. Added to it is individual economies' peculiarities, individual economy and their outcomes and spillovers of the way in which the COVID time handling had happened. So just to give where Indian economy is placed, a brief picture. Of course, I start with being the fastest growing economy. Domestic investment is also robust. So in another few days, you're going to get the GDP numbers for the first quarter of 23-24. As things stand, nobody has a clue, but everybody feels that yes, the first quarter did go on well, so the numbers should be good. So India has actually showcased an accelerated pace of economic reforms in the last 9 years. Reforms had been sporadic before that, not to say that it didn't happen at all. It had happened since 91, all of us are talking about reforms, but it had been not predictable and very sporadic. In contrast as to what had happened in these last 9 years is that reforms, even during COVID period, had happened because we thought that was an opportunity rather than a challenge. So reforms have been continuing. Wide-ranging domains have been covered, whether it's fiscal, whether it's digital, whether it is physical infrastructure or social inclusion. You spoke about inclusion, yes, on social inclusion as well. So all these have positioned India on a higher and sustainable growth path. The budget in the government's budget had increased the capital outlay by about 33% in 23-24. The capital expenditure in total expenditure has gone up from 12.3% in 18 to 22.4% in 24 financial years. And I'm only quoting the budget estimates. Several measures have been implemented by our government, and it has incentivized states to increase their capital spendings. State capital expenditure has increased by 74.3% year on year in Q1 of FY24. To complement that of the centre's capex had increased in the same period by 59.1% for the same quarter. So, because of the enhanced provisioning, a doubt which was in the mind of a lot of people earlier said, what will happen to private investment if public investment is growing at this level? Actually, I'm happy to say this enhanced provision for capital expenditure by the government is now crowding in private investment. So the green shoots of a private capital expenditure upcycle can be palpably felt by most of the observers. So also the measures taken during the COVID, immediately after the COVID, have all been recognized by international agencies, saying 13.5 crore Indians escaped multidimensional poverty between 2015-16 and 2019-2021. So this is attributable clearly to the government's strategic focus on achieving universal access to basic amenities. So escaping poverty, this bulk section which comes out of this is naturally going to form the layer of the aspirational middle class, hoping to better their livelihood, better their living standards, and also expect to access most of the services which are so required for good health and good education. So this naturally is going to bring in the virtuous cycle of consumption, savings, and human capital accumulation as well. Now, if I were to therefore go back to talking about the topic that you've given me, there are 5 things which I'll highlight as key priorities for sustained global economic growth. For global economic growth, my priorities would be taming inflation. So that's critical and absolutely critical. There's a lot of expectation on what the Fed is going to say from Jackson Hole. All of us are wondering how that is going to come out, because its spillover is also something which we notice. So key priority for economic growth is taming inflation, because persistently high inflation will weaken demand. It's basic economics. I'm not saying anything new. Equally, elevated interest rates for considerable time can come in the way of economic recovery. So the tendency to use interest rates as the only solution for dealing with inflation has its own downside. And most economies do have this problem, because I think, for want of a better word, obsession with using interest rate as the only tool to deal with inflation and not manage the supply side factors will not give a complete solution for inflation. Temporarily it can give, but sooner the supply side issues can creep their ugly heads up. So the task therefore for the central banks, and I know I'm treading on an area which people would be curious to know, did she comment on central bank? But task for central bank therefore will have to keep, particularly in today's context, is to keep in mind growth and growth related priorities, even as equally looking at controlling inflation. The fiscal deficit needs also to be restrained. Otherwise, inflation is not going to be wholesomely defeated or brought under control. The second of the priorities I'd like to put before you is increasing the emphasis on investments to spur growth. That's a sure shot route to achieving growth, sustained growth, and therefore investment in physical assets needs to be substantially raised, driven by the public sector if it is possible, and complemented by private sector. So the public sector may also have to take the lead until the private sector steps in. That's the story which is happening in India, and you see unrelentingly Government of India looking focused for increased public expenditure. But I can see that it is also now attracting private sector to come in and invest. To have a large multiplier impact on recovery and growth, therefore, investments is the best answer. The labor force participation and also improving on productivity simultaneously with increasing investments are two essentials to go with it, and labor force participation rates will have to therefore increase, for which enabling policies will have to be made. Post-pandemic, only a few countries will have the fiscal room to increase public expenditure on capital, yet it has got to be increased. There is no way of looking at constraints and saying I can't have expenditure from public for capital increase. The third of the important factor is raising investments, even as I say for public expenditure, for investments, for infrastructure. I would say focusing on investments in public health and education is a very key priority for sustained growth. So globally, I think the focus should be on health and education, it is not as if only India, because it's part of the emerging market world, it has to spend on health and education. Health systems are collapsing even in developed countries. And unless money goes into that, we will have a health crisis. And it's no good to differentiate between developed countries and developing countries. Health is got to be kept up always in a very robust and dynamic fashion. Skilling also is important, and that's why I group it under education and health as two important public expenditure items. The fourth one, which I would say as very key to sustaining growth, is climate change finance. I know the B20, I know the climate related groups, and also others are talking about climate financing. We've started with a sense of pessimism only because the 100 billion has never come on the table, but there are always the other side which says we didn't know what this 100 billion is going to go for. It has never been defined. There are legitimate arguments being put forward saying that is why the 100 billion has never come on the table. But the fact remains that few countries, and I'm happy to say India is one among them, have funded their own commitments given in Paris and fulfilled their nationally determined commitments with their own resources. Not very many countries are going to be lucky to do that. And for India too, the transition period is going to be a challenge if we have to fund it all on our own resources. So financing climate change is a key factor for sustaining global economic recovery. Now, this money is one thing when we say we need the money for transition as well, but we need the money for technology as well. We need the money for transition, we need the money for technology as well. And then, if both these are made available, very many countries which are in no position to, fund their own climate commitments can also give us a positive result. But climate is such a matter that no country on its own fulfilling the goals will suffice. It has to be global action. No individual country can sufficiently do enough for the global shortcomings. So it has to be everybody on their own, equally, everybody contributing for the whole. The fifth point, which I think is very important towards sustaining global economic recovery, is diversification of supply chains. The world in the next 50, 60 years cannot afford one more jolt in the supply chains, or one more disruption to the supply chains will be ruinous. And therefore, unless we quickly diversify our supply chains, well-functioning international markets with resilient and efficient supply chains are the ones who can help us in sustaining our growth. So we need to cushion ourselves sufficiently against any shock that can happen. So it is a old wisdom, putting all the eggs in one basket is not going to help. For the safety of everybody and also for ensuring global stability, and therefore, of course, talking about global recovery, we need to have supply chains diversified. Now, in particular, strengthening India's position in the global economy over the next decade, I have just a few thoughts to share with you, and I'm sure you have been discussing it since the morning, and you'll have probably a lot more practical solutions to come up with, which I'll be happy to hear when the outcome reports come. India is growing forward, anchored on Atmanirbhar Bharat. I think the initial doubts that very many people had about Atmanirbhar Bharat, whether it is an inward-looking India that we are planning, whether we are going to stop imports, are quelled, they are completely dispelled. Atmanirbhar is more for India to be sure that every sector of its economy can grow, whether if some essential imports have to come in, we are not going to stop that. So we are focusing our approach in building an Atmanirbhar Bharat. We are focusing on infrastructure and also making sure compliance burden come down. So several sincere pursuit of reforms so that compliance is not going to be continuing to be a festering problem for us. We did remove a lot of archaic laws. Continuously engagement with industry gives us clue where we have to remove the burden, but that's an ongoing work, and I wouldn't think it's going to reach its conclusion too quickly because it's a dynamic situation there. Enough is said about national infrastructure pipeline and also the monetization pipeline. PM Gati Shakti program is also something in which we are getting layers of information as to where the obstruction for speedily taking a decision lie, and it is easy for us to cull them out. So we have adopted a transparent methodology so that compliance burden is eased out and also speedy decision making can happen. We've come up with production linked incentives, and also the particular thing which I would like to put forth before you is the semiconductor mission which was announced in 2021, and it had an outlay of 76,000 crores, approximately 10 billion US dollars. This is expected to pay the way for India's growing presence in global electronics value chain, and I'm sure the industry is quite seized of this, and you would leverage it to your advantage. We recognize that the FDIs, the foreign capital flows, are vital for our growth story. So simplification and rationalization of foreign portfolio investors regulations are going through reforms. Increase in aggregate foreign investment limits are also being looked into. We have looked at introduction of a common application form for registration of FPIs and opening up of new channels of debt investments like the voluntary retention route and fully accessible route. So I think India stands as an attractive destination for FDIs. We are working to provide a transparent and predictable and easily comprehensible policy framework. A lot of emphasis has been placed on GIFT IFSC. Many of you who have visited the GIFT city know that that place is changing rapidly, particularly post this real-time connection between Singapore and India's exchange at the GIFT city. A lot of change is happening, and it is worth looking at it. Fintech sector and also the digital markets are something which are ever expanding, giving scope for all of us to know how we can build on opportunities. The last point that I'd like to highlight, critically, India's digital public infrastructure has been welcomed by every country. In fact, in the G20, I wouldn't be wrong in saying that every one of my counterpart has come before me to say what India has achieved, both in scale and the speed, in putting through a digital infrastructure which is publicly held, government held, but which is accessible for private use, and it is now adapted by common Indian citizens. The combination of the three, publicly held, available for private use, and being adopted by common Indian buyer and seller, have really helped India's digital story. And there's a great lot of appreciation about the way in which we've gone about it. India Stack is now actually branding India outside, and we are happy to have knowledge shared with whoever who wishes to see how it might be, or at least one of the bricks in the India Stack could help their own economies. I think eventually, to sustain growth, global growth, and to have India's contribution to this sustained global growth, I think public-private collaboration is going to be very key. It's not just for the digital world, but even otherwise. No longer can governments do business in isolation. When I say business, even the governance-related business. No longer governments can do business in governance or carrying forward governance in isolation. It has to be with stakeholders equally taking ownership of what is happening and pushing the world for a better world tomorrow, rather than leave it for all of us to wonder who's going to take the lead. So with those words, I thank you for giving me this opportunity. It was good sharing my thoughts with you.
People have been reaching out, wanting to ask questions, and Madam Finance Minister has agreed to take a couple of questions. Arvind Krishna has reached out. Arvind Krishna, CEO of IBM. He has the first question.
Thank you. Madam Finance Minister, thank you for the comments. I was especially gratified to hear your focus on both investment taming, that's a nice word, and capital investment. Inflation taming. So you also mentioned both FDI and private-public partnerships. What advice or encouragement would you give those of us who are from multinational companies but wish to have strong operations in India and from India to serve the world? What advice would you give us in that context is a question, because we've been very happy with the support we have received so far, but when we hear comments around both Atmanirbhar, which you raised, as well as some of the talk around free trade, it opens up questions. So just looking for advice and encouragement.
Comments about free trade should actually encourage you to be in India, because I can see so much of effort being put by the Commerce Minister and his team. I probably will not be wrong in saying an agreement, FTA agreement, is very close for a final call with the UK. And I think negotiations with Canada are also progressing, and I expect that to come to a conclusion sooner rather than later. So agreements have already been signed, you know, with Australia, with UAE and so on. So FTA should actually encourage you to be in India, because lots of signings are happening. Advice, very difficult word. So anything I say is not advice, it's more to put the facts before you. I think you have a government which brought in stability in policy. You have a government which has shown that we are not thirsting for more revenue with some tax rates being, you know, increased here and there. I thought I said Atmanirbhar is no more a worry. It's been sufficiently explained, but IBM probably is outside of that realm. I'll be quite happy to sit with you to convince you my Atmanirbhar is not going against my globalization. Above all, I think Indian economy's resilience, the rate at which it's growing, and it's not just me claiming, you see every segment of India's economy showing that they're all actively on the move, wanting to build and wanting to grow. Our youth are revving to meet their aspirations. So if you were to take a global picture, India's economy speaks for itself. And I thought global investors look for such destination. And you would want democracy, you would want a free society with a lot of freedom of speech, irrespective of what some of Western newspapers would write. Because a lot of people who are speaking against the government even today happily continue to do it, and we don't mind. We have no problem with that. So democracy, youth, large market, purchasing power going up, poverty reduction, investor-friendly climate. I would think more can be done. We shall do it as well. So you should be here doing business and also doing a bit of tourism.
Ma'am, last evening I was having an informal dinner with about 10 CEOs, multinational CEOs. They asked me what can they do. So I asked only one thing. All of you commit to spend 1 month in a year full-time based out of here. Rest will take care of itself. The second question is from, I think, Lord Bilimoria.
Thank you very much, Ranja. Minister, what an excellent speech and what encouraging words about growth and encouraging investment, which is music to our ears. If I may, have two questions for you. One is, I had the privilege when I was president of the Confederation of British Industry, the sister organization of the CII, for 2 years until June 2022, to chair the B7 when the UK hosted the G7, and India was invited to the G7. Isn't it about time that India should be in a new G8? After all, it is the 5th largest economy in the world, and I predict it will be the largest economy in the world by 2060. My second question, you mentioned FTAs, free trade agreements. I've been working from the UK side to conclude the UK-India FTA, which Boris Johnson said would finish by Diwali last year. Well, we're coming up to Diwali this year. Can you give us some reassurance that this deal will be concluded very, very quickly? And what do you think the benefits of an FTA like that are going to be, let alone the EU-India FTA, which I hope is down the tracks as well? Thank you.
Well, first of all, FTA with UK, FTA with Canada, I forgot to add FTA with the EFTA countries as well. So the Commerce Ministry is definitely putting all the efforts there. And from finance, we have very closely worked with Commerce Ministry and also been part of the negotiating team. I can surely say that the teamwork between the commerce and the finance negotiating team members is showing positive results. And the speed with which it is going on now gives me certainly a hope that this year we should be able to conclude the agreement with FTA. So what are the benefits that I see? Yes, Brexit has happened, but still you can play the role of a threshold towards Europe, also the EFTA countries and the Nordic countries, I would think. But the fact that at this stage we are tying up the agreement with one of those Western developed countries also shows that India is opening up for a lot more than what ideally would be seen as, oh, that's a market which I like to be. This is a market which is looking to have an agreement with me. No, I'm open for anybody. Just get on negotiating with us, and mutually we should benefit from agreeing with each other. And one FTA can have its own spillover on a second FTA and so on for both the countries. So I would think it's not difficult to guess that the agreement with agreement with UK should get concluded sooner. And not like last year. For whatever reason, last year it couldn't happen. But I think this year there's hope that we'll finish it fast.
One last question. Janmai?
Finance Minister, we're talking about sustained global economic recovery. The one concern I have is China. There are 7 factors that are going against China. You know, its exports, its real estate sector, its technology sector, the leverage in its local municipal government, the fact that, you know, they have still got a very infrastructure heavy economy and not enough consumption spending. They are supposed to add $11 trillion in the next 7 years to global GDP. I really don't believe that will happen. We are dependent on them, the world is dependent on them. How do you think the slowing down of China is going to impact us and the world?
It's a matter which all of us will have to be concerned with, there's no doubt. And the impact of a slowing China, particularly with multifaceted problems about which we get scanty reports. I don't think we have sufficient information to think clearly on what exactly is happening. But even with that, and that is not new, information comes very sketchily about China, even through the global observers and so on. But I'd rather play the India story more for itself rather than as a, no, China is not working out, so India. No, I think India is showing strength in so many different areas, which are new age areas. Whether it is hydrogen, whether it is the way in which the mission is working on, maybe even in China they had worked on it. I'm not getting into that. I'm more presenting India for what it has as its strength now, particularly with the young population, which is a skilled population, an English-speaking population, and a population which goes by a transparent system of governance, and a system where the legal remedies are available through courts. Anybody can go, nobody stops a foreigner or an Indian from going to the court to seek legal redress. So when you have a system, you may have 1,000 complaints saying, no, it takes long to get a decision, it takes long to, the layers of, judicial redress are too many. Whatever be it, we are trying to efficiently make them available, bring in transparency, bring in technology into decision making, and so on. So with all these changes, the earlier gripe that anyone would have had about time-consuming processes are all coming down now. So whilst I'll keep a watch on the developments happening in China, even with sparse information, what I'm more putting my energy on is, this is the moment for India. Every aspect where you need government to come in to help, and every aspect in which it has to stay away from, we are fully going by that. We want a system where it is easy to do business in India. We want to attract investment and make sure opportunities are available for all. And therefore, more than playing up on the troubles of China, I'd rather play on the opportunities that exist in India, the skills and the kind of work culture where the young are revving to go forward and they want to prove themselves. You have an efficient workforce which is amenable to the global practices. That is why I understand the global capacity centers which are coming into India are coming in a very big way. And these are small indicators of, you being able to attract people to come in India. So look at us for the responsive and stable policy giving government, which is what Prime Minister Modi gives you. Look at us for opening up the economy in some of the areas where nobody ever thought India will open up. Space. This is an area which I don't need to talk about. The memories are fresh. Only 2 days ago you saw what India can achieve. And who are the people who are doing it there? That should tell you what kind of people exist in parts of the country which you probably never visited. Those space scientists are coming from unknown small towns, qualified, dedicated, and for the kind of money they can get outside, they've not chosen to go outside, they're here doing it. And doing something which no country has done, for instance, landing in the south pole of the moon. Indian scientists have done it, and these are young men and women who come from tier 2, tier 3 cities. You would have never heard of them. They probably came to Indian Institute of Sciences. And they have given us this breakthrough in space. So you can imagine similar brothers and sisters of those who are in space today are there for you to use them and for their skills. So that's India for you. That's the young India for you. That's the aspirational India for you. And that's that India which is waiting to showcase its talent. So speak for the strengths that India has and not for the suffering of somebody.
So, thank you, Honorable Finance Minister. I think really we have enjoyed what you shared with us today. Thank you not only for sharing what we could do, but also what the G20 countries could do to make sure that we continue to grow. But I think we also owe you a very special thanks for having deftly managed the situation post-COVID to bring us back to this position where we are. So, thank you from all of us for making that happen. And I hope that you will use the G20 platform to also make sure that the reforms in the multilateral agencies takes place for the funding of the global south and the sustainable development goals as well. Yes, thank you for that.
The author of that report is sitting here,
Yes,
so you should engage with him.
He's next on stage.
Thank you, madam. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Honourable Minister of Finance and Corporate Affairs, Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman. Thank you very much. Please remain in your places, ladies and gentlemen.